Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's great to be in Ann's store. I remember reading about it 5 years ago. It's such an honor to be here and to see what an amazing bookshop this is, and to see you all here today in Nashville. I'm happy to talk about my new book, Killers of the Flower Moon. It's a bit of a mouthful to say. The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. And the book began about 5 or 6 years ago when I made a trip out to the Osage Nation in northeast Oklahoma. And when I was there, I stopped at the Osage Nation Museum. And on the wall, I saw this enormous panoramic photograph. This is just a fragment of it. Oops, did it work? Nope. Need a little help?
Need a little help?
Yeah, tech help? I'll keep talking and then we'll get the photograph. On the wall was this enormous panoramic photograph. It was taken in 1924, and in fact, if you have the book, you can see it across the title page. And it looked very innocent. It showed white settlers and members of the Osage Nation. But when I looked at it carefully, I noticed that a portion of the photograph was missing. Somebody had taken a scissors to it. And I asked the then museum director what had happened to the missing panel. And she said that there was a figure standing there so frightening that she decided to remove it. She then pointed to the missing panel and she said the devil was standing right there. And the book really grew out of trying to understand who that figure was and the anguishing history he embodied. And it led me to one of the most sinister crimes, as I would come to realize, in American history, one that I believe tells a much larger story about this country. To understand these crimes, they took place in the 1920s. And back then, what you need to understand is that the Osage Indians in Oklahoma were millionaires. They had been driven onto their land, and oil had been discovered underneath it. And to extract that oil, prospectors had to pay the Osage for leases and royalties. And there was only about 2,000 Osage at the time. And initially, in the early 1900s, they would receive a check every 4 months, and the check of those 2,000 would be a few $100s. A few years later, it was worth $1,000. And then over time, it had accumulated to millions and millions of dollars. In 1923 alone, the Osage had received what would be worth today. Perfect. All right, perfect. So I won't repeat myself, but I'll just take you back to that photograph for a second. This was the photograph at the Osage Nation Museum. And this photograph, when you see it across the book, it went across the whole wall. It was kind of amazing. And again, it was taken in 24. But one portion, actually over on this side, was missing. And that's where she pointed, and she said the devil was standing right there. And as I began to do more research, again, I learned that the Osage back in the 20s when these crimes took place were among the wealthiest people in the world. Prospectors would drill on their land. And I told you a little bit about the wealth. And let me just give you one statistic, which I think stands out. In 1923, that year alone, those 2,000 or so Osage received collectively what would be worth today more than $400 million. They had become the wealthiest people per capita in the world. A newspaper reporter at the time from New York said, lo and behold, the Indian, instead of starving to death, enjoys a steady income that turns bankers green with envy. And the public became transfixed with the Osage's wealth, which belied these very long-standing racial stereotypes that traced their way all the way back to the first brutal contact with whites, the original sin from which the country was born. And reporters would travel out to Osage territory and regale the readers, often infused with prejudice and envy, about the quote-unquote plutocratic Osage and the red millionaires with their terracotta mansions and their chauffeured cars and their servants, many of whom were white. It was said at the time, whereas one American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them. This picture I particularly like because it shows a traditional Osage mother at the time with her 2 daughters dressed as flappers. And quite remarkable, I found this footage that an Osage had taken during the 1920s of the region. He had one of the early motion picture cameras that you could have individually own. And a descendant recently found this footage and restored it. And I'll just play it for a second. It'll give you just a sense of what these boom towns looked like in the 1920s. This is Pawhuska, which was the county seat. And the tangled history of how the Osage got hold of this oil-rich land traced its way all the way back to the 17th century, when the Osage controlled much of the central part of the country, a territory that stretched from what is today Missouri and Kansas all the way to the edge of the Rockies. President Thomas Jefferson in 1803 referred to the Osage as the Great Nation. And the following year, he actually met with the delegations of Osage chiefs at the White House. He described them as the finest men he had seen, and he promised them that they would be treated only as friends. But within a few years, he began to force them off their land. And within a few decades, the Osage were forced to cede more than 100 million acres of their ancestral land. They were eventually confined to a reservation in Kansas, and in the 1860s, they were once more under siege by white settlers. And among those settlers was none other than Laura Wilder Ingalls' family, who later wrote Little House on the Prairie, loosely based on her experiences. In a scene in the novel, Laura asks her mom, "Why don't you like Indians?" "I just don't like them. And don't lick your fingers, Laura." "This is Indian country, isn't it?" Laura said. "What did we come to this country for if you don't like them?" One evening, Laura Ingalls' father explains to her that the government will soon make the Osage move away. Quote, "That's why we are here, Laura. White people are going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we get here first and take our pick." In fact, many settlers began to seize the land by force. Several Osage were massacred. And in the 1870s, the Osage agreed to sell their land in Kansas and search for a new homeland. And it was then that this Osage chief stood up at a tribal council meeting, and a record of his speech still exists. And he said, "We should move to what was then Indian Territory." It would later become Oklahoma. And he said, "We should go there because the land is rocky, it's hilly, and it's infertile. And the white man will finally leave us alone. My people will be happy in this land." So they actually purchased that land. It was about the size of Delaware, but it was deemed worthless by whites. They had a deed to their land, and they resettled there. By then, the forced migrations, diseases, massacres had taken a tremendous toll on the tribe. There were only a few thousand left, about a third of what they had been just 7 years later. Here you can see an early Osage camp on the reservation. Now, in 1906, shortly before Oklahoma became a state, the U.S. government forced upon the Osage the final stage of its brutal assimilation campaign, which was called allotment. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it was forced upon many American Indian nations across the country. And what it meant was it would break up the reservations, divvy up the land into allotments. Each American Indian that was part of the tribe would receive a parcel, and the rest would be opened up to settlers. Now, the Osage had seen what had happened to other territory very near them when it was opened up to settlers. This is a picture of one of the Oklahoma land runs, and this is an actual photograph of it. And literally, settlers raced to get there. If you put your stake in the land first, you actually claim that parcel. People were trampled, some were shot trying to get there first. Now, the idea behind allotment was to end the communal ownership of land and to turn the Osage and other American Indians into private property owners, which would not incidentally make it much easier to procure their land. But the Osage had more leverage than many other American Indian nations when they were negotiating with the government because they had a deed to their land. They had purchased it. What's more, Oklahoma was about to become a state, and the Osage had resisted allotment, so they were the last tribe to be allotted in the state. And they managed to slip, they were actually led also, this is a critical point, they were also led by one of their greatest chiefs, a man who spoke 7 languages, including French, Sioux, and Latin. And he and other Osage, during their negotiations, managed to slip into their agreement with the U.S. government a provision that at the time seemed rather curious. It essentially said, "We will maintain control of all the subsurface mineral rights to our land." And they managed to get that into the agreement. Now, once Oklahoma became a state in 1907 and the territory was allotted, most of the surface territory disappeared into the hands of whites, as it did with other reservations that were allotted. But the mineral surface were collectively controlled. Each Osage was given what was called a head right, essentially a share in the mineral trust. You could not buy or sell a head right. So while the surface territory disappeared, the Osage, those 2,000 or so, collectively maintained control of what had become the world's first underground reservation. And before long, the oil boom had begun. Now, there was such demand for oil once it was discovered that some of the largest deposits in the country were sitting right under this once seemingly forsaken territory, that the Osage would hold auctions. And so many oilmen that you've heard of, J.P. Getty and his family, they first discovered oil in Osage territory. That's where they first made their money. E.W. Marland made a fortune, then blew it. Harry Sinclair, Frank Phillips and his brother. Here you could see them arriving, Frank Phillips and members of his company, arriving for an auction. They would arrive on these railroad cars, private railroad cars that were known as the Millionaire Special. And they would gather under this great stately elm tree where an auctioneer would give leases. A lease was usually for about a 160-acre tract. A lease could sell for as much as $2 million. And this tree soon became known as the $1 Million Elm. Now, as the Osage's wealth prosperity increased, many Americans, because of prejudice, began to express growing alarm. The Osage were scapegoated for their money, even though this was the 1920s, this great era of prolificacy, this era of Great Gatsby. Somehow, the idea that the Osage had money provoked members of the U.S. Congress to sit in these mahogany panel rooms and to debate, what are we going to do about this Osage wealth, as if the nation's country security was at stake. And they actually went so far as to appoint white guardians to many Osage to manage their fortunes. This system was quite literally racist. It was based on the quantum of Osage blood. So if you were a full-blooded Osage, you were deemed incompetent, and you were given a guardian to manage your wealth. Here you could be a great Osage chief who led a nation and have millions of dollars in your trust, and you could have a white guardian telling you what car to buy, whether you can get this toothpaste at the corner store. An Osage chief complained at the time that we are not children, we are men, and this is a great injustice. And not only was the system racist, it also created one of the largest state and federally sanctioned criminal enterprises in American history, because many of these guardians would direct purchases for each to friends' stores where they would get kickbacks, they would skim money off the top, and often they would just outright embezzle and steal millions and millions of dollars. This Osage chief who testified before Congress, he said that before Congress, complaining that the whites had bunched us down in the roughest part of the country, thinking we shall drive these Indians down to where there's a big pile of rocks and put them there in that corner. Now that the pile of rocks had turned out to be worth millions of dollars, he said, everybody wants to get in here and get some of that money. Then the Osage began to die under mysterious circumstances. One family in particular was profoundly affected, the family of this woman, Molly Burkhart. Molly was a really remarkable woman. She was born in the 1880s in a lodge, much like the lodge you saw in that early Osage camp. They looked like wigwams. Speaking only Osage, practicing Osage traditions. She was forced and uprooted from her home because of the federal government and had to go to a boarding school at the age of 7, where she suddenly had to learn English, remove her Indian blanket, and learn a whole new bewildering philosophy and theology about the world. And within a few decades, because of the money under her wealth, she lived in a mansion. She married a white settler, a man named Ernest Burkhart from Texas. And in many ways, Molly straddled not only 2 centuries, but 2 civilizations. Now, in 1921, in May, Molly had a sister named Anna Brown. Here you can see a picture of her. Anna came over to the house that day. Molly loved to entertain. She was having a party that night. Lots of relatives were there. Anna left the house and was not seen again. She disappeared. And Molly looked everywhere for her. She had family members look for her. And a week later, Molly was found in this ravine with a bullet in the back of her head. And it was the first hint that her family had become a prime target of a criminal conspiracy. Now, not long after that, literally within days, Molly's mother, Lizzie, you can see her in the middle of the picture, Anna's on one side and Molly is on the other, began to grow mysteriously sick. Each day she seemed to get more insubstantial, as if she were withering away. And within 2 months she stopped breathing, and evidence would later suggest that she had been poisoned. And so within the span of 2 months, Molly had lost not only her sister, her older sister Anna, she had lost her mother, who was one of the last of the Osage elders who still practiced Osage traditions, all the old traditions, and spoke Osage. Now Molly had another sister, a younger sister named Rita Smith. And Rita was so terrified. She had lived in the countryside with her husband and a maid. And she decided to move closer to Molly, closer to town. She moved into this house here where she thought she would be safer. And then one night at about 3 a.m, Molly heard a loud explosion. She got up frightened. She went to the window and she looked out in the direction of where her sister's house, Rita, had been. And all she could see was an orange ball rising into the sky. It literally looked as if the sun had burst violently into the night. And in the place where her sisters had, nothing existed. Somebody had planted a bomb underneath it, killing everybody inside, including Molly's sister Rita, Rita's husband Bill, and an 18-year-old maid who left behind 2 young children. And it wasn't just Molly's family that was being systematically targeted. There was an Osage champion steer roper who one day received a call. He went outside. When he came back to the house, he dropped dead, frothing at the mouth. Evidence will later indicate that he was given poison, most likely strychnine. And for those of you who read Agatha Christie mysteries, you know that this is one of the most awful, brutal poisons. It causes your whole body to convulse as if with electricity. You're conscious while you slowly suffocate until you mercifully die. And several of those who also tried to catch the killers were themselves killed. There was an attorney who began to gather evidence. He stashed it in a hideaway. One day he went to Oklahoma City, where an Osage was dying of poisoning and wanted to give him evidence. So he told his wife, he had 10 children, and he told his wife where he was storing the evidence. He said, if anything should happen to me, go get it. I've also left money for you. He then went to Oklahoma City. He met with this Osage. He gathered the evidence. After the Osage died, the lawyer called authorities in Osage County. He said, I've got the evidence we need to catch one of the killers. I'm coming back home. I'll be on the train. They waited for him on the train. When the train arrived, he didn't get off. Bloodhounds took up the search. Boy Scouts looked for him. And eventually his body was found lying on the tracks. His neck had been broken. He had been thrown from the speeding train. Another man who was a friend of the Osage, a white settler, an oilman, had gone to Washington, D.C. To tell authorities to please intervene. And when he got to a boarding house in the Capitol, he received a telegram from an associate in Oklahoma. It said, be careful. He carried with him just a Bible and a pistol. He stepped out of the boarding house that night. He was abducted. At some point, a burlap sack was wrapped around his head. His body was found in a culvert the next day. He had been beaten to death and stabbed more than 20 times. The Washington Post reported on its front page in a headline what the Osage already knew and deeply understood, which was a conspiracy to kill rich Indians. In 1923, after there were more than 24 Osage murders, the Tribal Council issued a resolution pleading with federal authorities who would not be tainted by corruption. So many of the local authorities seemed indifferent to these crimes because of prejudice, because the victims were Native Americans. Molly Burkhart showed tremendous courage crusading for justice, but many of her complaints were ignored. She issued rewards. She even hired private detectives that often filled the void. What was remarkable when I did research was just how lawless this country still was in the 1920s and how rotten to the core many of our legal and judicial institutions were. And they were particularly so in this area. Often private detectives would fill the void, and Molly hired them. But the problem with private detectives is they were often available to the highest bidder. And they also often had criminal backgrounds. The boundaries between a good man and a bad man were extremely porous. And many of the private detectives that Molly and other Osage hired seemed to be covering up evidence rather than unearthing it. And so they went and they issued this tribal resolution asking for federal authorities to come in. And it was then that the case was taken up by a rather obscure branch of the Justice Department that was then known as the Bureau of Investigation, and that would later be renamed and that we know of as the FBI. And it was in 1925 that this man, Tom White, a field agent from Houston, was summoned to Washington to meet with the new bossman in person, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover wanted to see him right away. White, in many ways, like Molly, he's a remarkable individual who in many ways straddled two centuries and reflects the transformation of the country. He was born in a log cabin on the frontier of Texas. He came from a tribe of lawmen. He was a former Texas Ranger. He was a lawman early on when the law was often justice was often meted out by the barrel of a smoking gun. By the time he's summoned to Washington in the 1920s, he's got to wear a suit, although he was defiantly wearing a cowboy hat. He has to learn to adopt modern techniques like fingerprints. He has to file paperwork, which he can't stand. Now, in 1917, when he joined the Bureau, it was a pretty ragtag operation, had only about 100 agents or smattering of agents, only a few field offices across the country. They were not authorized to carry guns. They didn't actually have the power to make arrests. If they wanted to make an arrest, they'd actually have to call up the local sheriff or the local police officer and say, can you round this guy up for us? They had very limited jurisdiction over crimes, but they had jurisdiction over American Indian reservations, and that's why this murder case fell to them, and that's why it became one of the FBI's first major homicide investigations. So when White shows up to headquarters, he doesn't quite know why the new boss man, Hoover, has summoned him. Hoover was only 29 years old at the time. He didn't have any of his famous jowls, his bulldog. He had been just named director in 1924. He had been purging many of the old frontier lawmen in favor of a new breed of agent, these guys who typed faster than they shot. The old-timers like White referred to them as the Boy Scouts. And in fact, they had very little experience with criminal investigations. And so Hoover kept on the rolls just a few of these old frontier lawmen like White, who were known as the Cowboys. Now, Hoover hated tall agents. He used to keep a dais behind his desk that he would stand on when agents would arrive. And tall agents were terrified to be summoned to headquarters because if he saw you were really tall, he might fire you. So when White showed up, he stood 6'4", and he was wearing a cowboy hat, which he was against protocol. He's looming over Hoover, and Hoover begins to tell him about the Osage murder case. Now, the Bureau had actually been working on the case for 2 years then, and the results had been completely disastrous. Not only had agents failed to make a single arrest, they had gotten an outlaw, a guy named Blackie Thompson, out of jail. They assured state authorities, don't worry, we got this covered. We're going to use him as an informant. We'll keep him under surveillance, don't worry. They quickly lost him. He slipped away, robbed the bank, and he killed the police officer. Now, poor Blackie, this is a picture of Blackie, who would later try to escape from prison and meet his own unfortunate fate. But Hoover was new in his job, and believe it or not, the greatest autocratic bureaucrat in the history of our country was actually worried about his position and power at that time. He was new to the job, and he feared that a scandal might end his dreams of a bureaucratic empire. The Bureau had just been caught up in the Teapot Dome scandal, which was another oil corruption scandal with kickbacks. The Bureau had up to its knees in it. And so he was really worried about the Blackie Thompson affair. He had actually tried to get rid of the Osage case and dump it back on state authorities because it was such a failure. But now he suddenly feared all this criticism. And so White realizes that he has been summoned to Washington not to be fired, but because Hoover needs him to basically save his tail. And so White takes over the Osage murder investigation. And White realizes, given the danger, that the only chance they have is to put together an undercover operation. And he recruits these operatives from among the cowboys, among the frontier lawmen. Most interestingly enough, one of the operatives was an American Indian. And even though the Bureau didn't keep statistics at the time, I think it's fair to say that he was the only American Indian in Hoover's Bureau. And they go in undercover. They pose as cattlemen. One poses as an insurance salesman. According to the records, he sold real policies. I have no idea what happened to those policies. And they begin to gather evidence, and they have to adapt all these various modern techniques. And the book's theme really is about the birth, not just of law enforcement, but also of the country. And one of the key parts of the evidence that they need to adapt is handwriting analysis, which becomes a key part. The case has many twists and turns, and in many ways, it reflected more an espionage case than a criminal investigation. There were moles, there were double agents, there was possibly a triple agent. You never know who you could trust. The reports would leak. They were being followed. They carried guns even though they were not authorized to protect themselves. And I won't give away, here's a picture of one of the undercover operatives. I won't give away the end because I think it is more powerful to read it in context, all the ins and outs. But ultimately, what White and his men did was follow the money. And the money, who was profiting from these crimes, and in particular, who was profiting from the murder of Molly's family members. And it led them to a very prominent white settler. What's more, it led them to somebody who was very close to Molly and her family. And that's one of the things that made these crimes so deeply sinister, that to steal the Osage oil money required an intimate deception. People would pretend to love these Osage, and they believed that these perpetrators loved them. And instead, all along, often for years at a time, they were plotting against them, calculating, lying to them, and deceiving them. It evokes to me the words that Shakespeare said in Julius Caesar. Where will thou find a cavern dark enough to mask thy monstrous visage? Seek none conspiracy. Hide it in smiles and affability. And after I had visited when I had visited that Osage Nation Museum and was looking at that picture, the museum director had gone downstairs and she retrieved a picture of the missing panel for me, and she showed it to me. And there, peering out from the corner very creepily, was one of the masterminds, that prominent settler that the FBI and Hoover had arrested. He was the so-called devil. And I think it's really important to understand, and I realized when I was there, that the Osage had removed that picture not to forget, as so many Americans had, but because they can't forget what had happened. Now, I just want to say a quick word about the structure of the book, because it's very unusual in terms of at least how I've structured a story in the past or a book in the past. It's told largely in three chronicles, largely from three distinct points of view. The first perspective is told from the vantage point of Molly Burkhart. And one of the reasons I did that is because when I read accounts about the case in the past, she was usually one sentence. Her story was always left out, even though she was the prime target and at the very center of the conspiracy. I told you a little bit about how remarkable she was, and one of the things most remarkable about her was she crusaded for justice, often in great peril to her own life. And I just want to mention one document in an archive I found regarding her, which was in 1934, 2 years before she died of natural death. I had found a document where she had appealed her incompetency. And the document from the court, from the legal system, said she was finally deemed competent. So in 1934, this woman was finally granted the rights, 2 years before she died, of a full-fledged American citizen with the same rights to control her fate, her destiny, her money, and her life. The second chronicle is told largely from the vantage point of Tom White, and here you can see his transformation with Hoover. Here he's wearing a suit and fedora, no longer the cowboy riding on a horse. And then the final perspective is told largely from the point of view of myself in the present. I went to Osage County, and one of the reasons I did this to show what it looks like today, what happened to their oil money. This is a bar I saw in Ralston, one of the towns where Anna Brown was last seen before she disappeared. For me, one of the most powerful things during my research was interviewing the descendants of both the murderers and the victims. One of the people I interviewed was Margie Burkhart, and she's a descendant, a granddaughter of Molly Burkhart. She She's a lovely woman. She told me what it was like to grow up without cousins, to have no aunts, what it was like for her father to grow up in a house of secrets, to know that your perpetrators were often living side by side with you. She took me out to the cemetery in Gray Horse, which is out on the prairie. It's a beautiful place. Those are the graves of Molly's family members, of Molly, of Anna, of her mother. And when you begin to look at the dates on those cemeteries, you start to see 1920, 1921, 1922, 1923. You start to look at the ages, and you begin to realize that you're witness to a real genocidal crime. Now, one of the reasons I told the story this way is because history is often elusive, especially in a criminal conspiracy. It's only over time, with more evidence, with more different perspectives, that you begin to get a more complete picture of what happened. And one of the things I try to show in my chronicle, based on a whole bunch of new evidence, archival evidence, interviews with descendants, is that there was a much deeper and darker conspiracy that the Bureau never exposed. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Do you think it's harder to write nonfiction or fiction?
Well, I think, believe it or not, fiction is much harder. I tried it very early in my career and realized I had none of the talent of some of our people here, and got out of it. For me, I don't have the imagination to invent stories. For me, it's finding the stories and then excavating what's really there. And so it involves a rigor, and it has its own challenges, but at least for my own talents, nonfiction is easier. Sure.
When you amass all this information, how do you go about organizing it and getting it?
Yeah, so if anyone had ever seen my office, they would know my system is chaos. It was really funny because I was always reading about Hoover for this book. And Hoover, Hoover's monstrous in so many ways. He was an organizational genius. I mean, the guy was just, he was just a phenom in terms of like cataloging his systems and where he would store all his secrets, and he had little labels, and like the material he wanted to use to like blackmail presidents, he kept in a separate private system in his secretary's office, and they had a mark like D, like essentially I think it was assumed that like if he died, destroy those. My office had none of that system. It was just basically chaos. Basically the information comes in and gets piled up. But this book, it took many years. It was by far the hardest and longest project I worked on. The reason for that was I really didn't want to just catalog the dead, and I really wanted, as best to my limited abilities, to try to capture the Osage perspective that I often felt was missing from the accounts. And so that involved a lot of archival research, and it involved tracking down a lot of the descendants to get their stories, their oral histories. And then organizing it. The real organizational challenge in some ways is just because these records and the information was so disparate. When I did at Lost City of Z, the explorer would write these long letters, and you could literally just pick the day where you're writing something that happened. You'd have a long description. Maybe you had a fellow explorer, and he'd have a long description. This information was scattered, and so the hardest part was really just typing it all into a database that then I could manipulate the information to create outlines. So the process of just typing it in was really boring. Yeah.
Regarding your sources, you mentioned the Osage Museum, and I assume that you have quite a bit of information there. What about the state of Oklahoma and its historical society? Did it contain information, useful information regarding this?
Yeah. So sadly, there's a plus in it. This episode of history is neglected everywhere. Not with the Osage, but even in Oklahoma, it's often overlooked. But the Osage Historical Society is actually a wonderful institution, and they were a great resource. They have a lot of oral histories. Oral histories during the Depression were taken of a lot of older Osage and recorded. They have lots of old newspapers in their archives. So they were actually a pretty wonderful institution, and very helpful and pretty well organized. I spent a lot of my time in a branch of the National Archives in Fort Worth, Texas. And it's a place that looks like basically something out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's this enormous gymnasium, not gymnasium, warehouse. It goes on and on. I mean, it's just enormous. And you get like these 2 pulls a day. You have to get your pull in at a certain hour. And I never could see it, but I just imagined the little pulley going up and pulling the box and bringing it down. And I spent weeks out there. And often, you're looking at tedious material, and then occasionally you just open up a folder and you would see like the secret grand jury testimony from the trials that, to the best of my knowledge, had never been made public. One of the documents I found there that was very revealing was I looked up guardians, the guardianship, and I was actually just trying to check the name of a guardian to see if he was a guardian of a certain Osage. I just wanted to confirm this fact. And so I pulled guardian papers. And in these records, there was a little booklet. It looked like a ledger, like something you would keep like in a bookstore just to kind of list your inventory. And all it said on it was the name of the guardian and then the Osage whose fortunes they were in charge of. And I was looking at it, I noticed that there was one guardian and they had 5 Osage that they had been in charge of their wealth. And next to the name, if the person had died, somebody had just written the word dead. And I noticed that under one guardian, it said dead, 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 dead. I said, that's crazy. I mean, it's just a few years. Then I kind of looked through, and I come to another, and I see that someone might, and again, I'm going by memory. So, but, they may have had 10 Osage, they would call them wards. And 50% of them were listed as dead. Now, it doesn't say what they died of. Some of them may have been natural causes, but it defies any natural death rate. I mean, Osage were wealthy. They had good doctors. And then I began to try to look into some of those individual cases. And in some of them, you could find hints of like a complaint at the time of a suspected poisoning or of a mysterious death. Or you would find that the wealth, the head right, the money, had ended up in the hands of the guardian. And you'd follow the money. And you realized, looking at this very forensic document that looked like a ledger, were basically the hints of a systematic murder campaign. And I often tried to imagine who that bureaucrat was who would simply write in the margins, dead. And it got to a larger question, which is that when I began the story, I thought of it as a singular crime with a singular kind of villain, the devil. And that's how we often think of crime stories, right? We think of, if you read Sherlock Holmes, there's like one Moriarty, whatever his name is, I can't think of it now, but the one bad guy, the supervillain, and then the law comes in and removes it. But in this case, the far more disturbing truth was that the devil or the evil or whatever you want to call it lurked in the hearts of many seemingly ordinary people. There were many conspirators. There were doctors who administered poison. There were reporters who refused to report on them. There were lawmen who were on the take. There were politicians who were on the take. There were neighbors who remained quiet because of prejudice or because of complicity. And so this really was less a story about who did it than who didn't do it, and much more about a story of a culture of complicity and a culture of killing. And that was perhaps the most disturbing and shocking thing that I found, and that document got to that.
First of all, thank you for the book and wading through all the chaos of your office. Second, about to that point of complicity by the community, did you notice any effort by the non-native faith community to comment or say anything or move? I mean, they had to have known, and obviously there was people that looked the other way. All that's required for evil to flourish is for good folks to do nothing. So I'm sure there's a lot of that. Did you notice anything?
That's a good question, because it is easy to paint with too broad a brush. And, certainly, and I think the story has a lot of it. The story has also a lot of good. Whether it's Molly Burkhart, someone like that who had amazing courage to crusade for justice, to kind of reckon with this truth. I could never fathom how she had to reckon with the truth. People like Tom White, he's just kind of a quietly good person. It's kind of hard to write about in a way, because he's just kind of quietly good. He's when a lot of people weren't. He's not Sherlock Holmes. He's, he misses parts of the case. He's not a genius or anything, but he's got a quiet goodness. And there were people who certainly were helpful. That lawyer who got thrown off a train. And so there certainly were people who tried, but it was the minority. It was the minority. People were getting unbelievably rich off these crimes. And what's important to understand is that this wasn't like holding up a bank. I mean, this wasn't like going to your store with, there were a lot of outlaws in the region. Blackie Thompson was a classic outlaw. Rob a train or break into a bank. They'd make off whatever, a few hundred, $1,000. No. These crimes were for millions of dollars. If you were able to steal these head rights, essentially you were guaranteed a check every 4 months. So it basically was, you would be accumulating millions of dollars. And so these were crimes of enormous fortunes. And the combination of greed and prejudice really created a toxic environment that led to these crimes. Yeah, in the back.
I'm from Oklahoma and been up to that area many times. Was E.W. Marlin involved in this sinister way?
Yeah, so the question was E.W. Marlin involved? So I did not find any evidence that E.W. Marlin was involved, and I did not find evidence that any of the wealthy, that some of the oil barons that I mentioned, that Getty or Sinclair or Skelly or the Phillips brothers, I never found any evidence that implicated them in any of the crimes. But I would say now history is a dodgy thing because you're limited by what you can find. So I say that with this proviso. But one of the things that did strike me is that these auctions were being held during the murders, and I was never able to find a single comment from any of these barons about the murders. Doesn't mean it didn't exist and I didn't find it, but there was, at least for me, a kind of shocking silence that they were not commenting on these crimes, and they certainly had the power. I did. And E.W. Marlin's an interesting case. He was one of the oilmen that got rich, and he has 2 mansions in Ponca City. I was just actually out in Ponca City, and I spent a lot of time in Osage Nation presenting the book and the findings, which was a really remarkable experience to do. But E.W. Marlin is a classic case because I actually describe him in the book, because he was this guy who made a fortune on oil. He actually discovered probably the largest deposit of oil, the Burbank field. I think it was like 1918, 1919. And, became like just a millionaire. He had this mansion, and then he said, that mansion isn't big enough, and he went and bought this other bigger mansion, and then he went totally bankrupt. And I use that as a case because somehow while that was happening, the U.S. government was deciding that somehow the Osage were the ones who couldn't handle their money, and I just always thought it pretty jarring. Yeah, anybody else?
I was just wondering, you sort of answered the question, but was there any problem getting the papers of the investigation from the Bureau, Federal Bureau, or did you have trouble, did you notice that police departments had possibly dumped investigations, if there had been any?
Yeah, I mean, I did Freedom of Information Acts to every institution I could think of, which basically asks anyone can do it, a citizen or reporter, asking basically for a release of documents. And the Bureau provided me with those documents. Interestingly enough, a lot of them are still partly blacked out, usually just the embarrassing parts like Blackie Thompson. I got a lawman who had access to them to leak them to me anyways. And I don't even think the Bureau in this case is covering up anything they don't want, but habits of secrecy die hard. And I was pretty successful in finding documents, but some documents be lost. The federal government, the good thing about Hoover was he made all those guys file. In fact, he was always firing them for not filing enough reports. I mean, the American Indian agent got fired after this case, even though he was a huge success and helped resolve this case, because he was an old frontier lawman. He hated paperwork, and Hoover was like, file me reports. They have to be on one page. I mean, he was a total bureaucrat. And so there were a lot of those records. The records were scattered, but they could be found, but it did take a while. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
What happened to the Osage men that tried? It seemed like it wasn't, I don't know if they chose not to marry him, but it seemed a little odd that none of the Osage tribal men did try to stand up to figure out.
Yeah. They certainly were prevalent, and They were led by a lot of actually great chiefs at that time and during that time period. Both Osage men were victims of the crimes, as were Osage women. Many of the Osage men also crusaded for justice, fought for justice. So they certainly are present and contributed. But the question does get to a larger point, which is that at that period, the Osage had become very unmoored from a lot of their traditions. Molly was actually somebody who had an Osage elder mother who practiced all the traditions. When you see Molly, she's still dressed pretty traditionally. Anna Brown, her sister, dressed less traditionally. Molly's trying to kind of straddle these two worlds, but there was a great deal of intermarriage at that time and a real unmooring of some of the Osage traditions.
Do they still have the ownership of the head rights?
They do. Now, a lot of money was swindled and never recovered. But they still collectively own it. Now, much of the oil has since been depleted, but someone like Margie Burkhart, the granddaughter, would still receive a quarterly check, but it would probably just be for a few $1,000s, not the kind of wealth that had once been.
Maybe time for a couple more?
Yeah, you keep an eye, because I don't know the time. Should we do 2 more?
Yeah, 2 more.
Okay, 2 more. 1 more there. Yep.
It seems like a big theme across your work is that there are these untold stories really deep beneath the surface, whether it's this or the French shell imposter, or the Texas arson or whatever, but you can't really know that up front when you start working on it. So how do you identify these ideas initially, and how often do you get into your process and then kind of have to bail because it's time for getting out?
Yeah, I bail on a lot. I just try to bail early on because the worst thing is if you're 2 years in and then you have to bail, you might have a little bit of a breakdown at that point. But so I'm pretty ruthless early on. I research a lot of story ideas. I try to be really aggressive early on and make some judgments. This was an interesting case. A book is different than a magazine story. So a book, the gamble of time investment is, I did not think this book would take me close to 5 years, but it did. And so the investment is so big. But for this one, for example, after I went out to that Osage Nation Museum, I wrote to every institution. I did FOIA requests. At that point, I just wanted to see what materials were out there. And I actually worked at the magazine, The New Yorker, where I work then. And during that year, the records would just come in, and I actually didn't even really look at them. I just put them in the corner. And after a year, I went and I began to go through them, and it would only provide about 1/100th of what I would need for the book, but it gave me enough confidence that there was enough trails of evidence and underlying material to write, to at least jump off a cliff. I wasn't until about 2 years in when I felt like, okay, I think I've got a book here. But you don't know in nonfiction where the story will take you. And I think the hardest thing is to be open-minded about that, because I think you can get locked in. And so one of the things that when I began to realize that this was a broader conspiracy, I realized that this story had unknowabilities. Now, as a reporter, an unknowability is like usually a huge weakness. How I know the reader's going to want to know answers to everything, right? And what if I can't provide all those answers because witnesses are dead, suspects are dead, I can't interrogate them? And I had this kind of panic about that a couple years in. How is this book going to resolve? And I'm a big believer that you have to, with nonfiction, be open to that mess, because otherwise you're not true. And one of the things I realized was that unknowability then became a theme of the latter part of the book, because it's the reality. And what the reality is that there was a secondary crime. And that is, with history, you often think of history as a way to provide accounting, especially when there's an injustice, that you can at least identify the killers and record the voices of the victims. In this case, the perpetrators, in many cases, because they covered up evidence, denied their victims even that accounting and even that history. And so that lack of history, that lack of being able to have pure resolution, to live with that doubt, is the reality. And to me, when I began the book, I was thinking about the theme of the horror of what you know. And by the end, what I realized is that it's often the horror of what you don't know. So you just have to kind of move the way the story takes you.
I just
just wanted to ask, when you went back to the Osage Nation and the surrounding cities and towns, interviewing the ancestors, did you find a legacy and a culture of forgiveness in that area between the different communities, or was there still strife and tension?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Did everyone hear that? Was there any kind of strife in the community? So what's amazing, and you also, when you begin a book, I thought, oh, okay, this is a story about a crime. And then and as you do more research, you also try to figure out what the book is about. And to me, this really is a microcosm of the clash between Native American white settlers that could be traced back, all playing out. It really is a story in many ways of the emergence of a modern country. And as testament to that is that in the same neighborhoods where the descendants of the victims live, the descendants of the perpetrators often live. They often live in the same neighborhoods side by side. Their fates are intertwined, and in many ways that is the story of America that we don't always want to tell or reckon with. And I interviewed an Osage elder who, at the end of the book, you will meet, a woman named Mary Jo Webb, and she told me, often the descendants, they don't fully know what their grandparents or their parents did, or they don't want to talk about it. She said, we try not to hold them accountable for the sins of their forebears. And I thought that showed a remarkable degree of forgiveness. And I also interviewed descendants of some of the murderers. And I received a note, remarkably, when I was in Oklahoma, and when I was in Tulsa, I was at an event just like this, and a descendant of the mastermind, the devil, was there and stood up, and then kind of spoke, about some of that shame about what the ancestors did. And actually Margie was there, and then she went and hugged Margie, which was kind of overwhelming. But I received a note from another descendant of that devil, and he wrote me a note saying, how remorseful he was about what his family history. And he says, if you see the Osage, will you please tell them that for me? And I did express that message when I was just back recently and saw them. I think is that it? Okay, one more. Okay, I don't want to get in trouble.
I'm Osage.
Oh, thank you for being
so
here.
I just wanted to say thank you, but also my mother was born in Pawhuska
Oh.
at the tail end of the Reign of Terror in 1925.
What was her last name?
Regard.
Oh, sure.
From the Regard family. We have one of the largest families on the Osage tribal rolls. So, but I wanted to add that during that time, it's been a part of our history, and I used to ask my grandmother questions, and there was such shame around all of that, and it was such a hidden part of the Osages that nobody even talked about it, and I couldn't really get too much out of it except that, this had happened, and the stories were not told until later on in the years later, like in the 40s and 50s, did I start hearing more and more versions of what had happened. And when you asked about the men, the men were also victims, that they would take them out and leave them with a bottle of alcohol and a gun, like they had committed suicide. And, there were so many little stories, that are now coming out, that I appreciate you including this as part of our history.
Well, thank you so
The
much.
other thing that's interesting, along with that period of time in 1906, is when they chose the tribal rolls in Oklahoma, all tribes. So they took like a census and opened those rolls every 5 years, and they closed them. And my grandmother's sister was the last Osage on the tribal rolls, and they gave her a name, an Osage name called Last Chance. So she was able to be one of the delegates going to Washington with our.
Oh, that's amazing. She just brings up one really important point, which I didn't make, which just made me think when I heard her speak, which is that, the Osage today are an incredibly vibrant nation. They have about 4,000 Osage, if my numbers are correct, live in Osage County. There are about 20,000 voting members of their democratic institutions. They have their own court system. They found other sources of revenue, casinos. And I always like to quote, which I quote in the book, an Osage lawyer who told me, we were victims of these crimes, but we don't live as victims. And I think I just want to make that point because I'm focusing on the past a lot, and I think it's important to bring it to the present. Thank you. And thank you all. I'm happy to sign books.